a development that unfolded not over months, not over weeks, but in a matter of 72 harrowing hours. 72 hours that redrew the strategic map of Eastern Europe. 72 hours that forced Washington into its most urgent posture since the Cold War. 72 hours that may have changed the trajectory of this conflict forever. What Vladimir Putin did this week crossed a line that the White House had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with unprecedented force, and with a message that echoed far beyond the battlefields of Ukraine. Tonight, we're going to break down exactly what happened, why Washington declared what multiple sources are calling a code red level threat assessment, and what Zelensky's so-called final option actually means for the months ahead. Because what we're witnessing right now isn't just another chapter in this war. It's a turning point. And by the end of this report, you'll understand exactly why. For several months now, there had been signals, not official briefings, not formal intelligence releases, just signals, that the Kremlin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a logic that Western analysts had learned to read. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence officers who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators, the movement of strategic assets, the rotation of command personnel, the sudden increase in encrypted traffic between Moscow and forward positions, the repositioning of nuclear-capable delivery systems. All of that went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. What analysts now believe is that the Kremlin was implementing the final stages of what internal documents allegedly refer to as the 2026 Consolidation Framework, a comprehensive plan designed to fundamentally alter the security architecture of Eastern Europe before the next US presidential transition. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was pattern recognition at the highest levels of American intelligence. And when the National Security Council convened an emergency session at 3 a.m. Eastern Time, they weren't discussing possibilities, they were discussing certainties. Early Thursday morning, U.S. Space Command detected what they described as anomalous strategic force posturing, including the activation of mobile launch platforms that had not been deployed in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only moves when they are signaling something very specific: escalation dominance, deterrence reinforcement, or preparation for a significant offensive operation. Pentagon analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Putin was changing his strategic posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, the entire U.S. national security apparatus pays attention. Within hours, satellite imagery confirmed what signals intelligence had suggested. Russian forces were repositioning assets across multiple theater commands simultaneously. Strategic bombers were moving to forward bases. Submarine activity in the Arctic increased by 40%. And most alarmingly, several units associated with Russia's tactical nuclear arsenal showed signs of heightened readiness. This wasn't a drill, this wasn't a training exercise, this was preparation, and Washington needed to respond. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Senior official after classified briefing described Putin's move as destabilizing, provocative, and perhaps most importantly, indicative of a fundamental shift in Russian strategic thinking. Multiple sources confirmed that the administration elevated its internal threat assessment to what one official described as Code Red Adjacent, a classification reserved for scenarios involving potential nuclear signaling or imminent large-scale conflict, but strategic ambiguity only works if the target hesitates. Zelensky did not. In fact, Ukraine's response today was among the most comprehensive and devastating we've seen since the war began. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of the intelligence being shared with Kyiv, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated strike campaign targeting Russian strategic infrastructure across occupied territories and deep into Russian soil itself. These weren't the limited precision strikes we've seen in recent months. These were full-spectrum offensive operations, systems and tactics that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally degrade Russian operational capacity. Tonight, Ukrainian military command confirmed that Special Operations Forces launched targeted strikes on 17 sites across Russian-held territory, including a command facility in Crimea that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a major offensive coordination role. Ukraine struck before Russia could execute. They hit ammunition depots in Belgorod. They hit fuel storage facilities near Rostov-on-Don. They hit communications nodes that were likely preparing to coordinate the next phase of Russian operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's 2026 plan, the infrastructure that would have made it operational. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Putin's repositioning wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could fundamentally shift the balance of this conflict if left unchecked. And Zelensky, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't target civilian areas, they didn't escalate beyond military necessity. They hit logistics hubs, they hit command centers, they hit the infrastructure that Russia needs to project power. And according to preliminary damage assessments shared with Western allies, the results were significant. Multiple facilities are now non-operational, several key supply routes have been disrupted, and Russian command and control in the southern theater has been degraded by what one analyst estimated at 30 to 40%. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence officials now believe that Putin's latest move was designed to test the resolve of Western support after months of political uncertainty in Washington and across European capitals. Putin wanted to see whether the alliance would fracture under pressure. He wanted to see whether Kyiv would hesitate. He wanted to see whether Washington would blink. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't hesitate. They launched a counteroffensive so rapid, so coordinated, that even Russian military bloggers acknowledged the severity. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Zelensky did. Defense analysts speaking with major outlets under anonymity described Putin's shift as coercive signaling, a way to create leverage before any potential negotiation window opens. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their strikes were not only effective, they were timed so precisely that Russian air defenses had minimal response capability. That timing matters because it shows intelligence coordination at the highest levels. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian moves. They are anticipating them, they are preempting them. And tonight they demonstrated that capability in the most emphatic terms possible. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian drone units carried out overnight strikes on at least 9 ammunition storage facilities, forcing emergency evacuations at several sites. Special operations teams targeted a railway junction that had been used for military logistics in the last 72 hours. Cyber units operating from undisclosed locations reportedly disrupted communications networks used by Russian forces to coordinate defensive positions. This wasn't just tactical response. This wasn't just battlefield adjustment. This was strategic counterpunch. This was demonstration of capability. And demonstration of capability is the one thing Putin has struggled to maintain since this conflict began. For every advance Russia has made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates Moscow's calculations. For every Russian escalation, there has been a Ukrainian answer. And tonight that answer was delivered with unmistakable clarity. Remember, Putin thought Western resolve would collapse after the first winter. He thought European energy dependence would fracture the alliance. He thought American political divisions would paralyze support. He thought Ukraine would negotiate from weakness. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Western support has consolidated around continued assistance. European nations are increasing, not decreasing, their contributions. And Ukraine is demonstrating military capability that exceeds what most analysts predicted 18 months ago. The narrative Putin constructed of inevitable Russian victory, of Western fatigue, of Ukrainian exhaustion is unraveling. And tonight's events accelerated that unraveling in ways that will be studied for years. What makes this moment so critical and so volatile is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under extraordinary internal pressure. Military hardliners want faster, more aggressive action. Economic advisers want stabilization and reduced sanctions exposure. Regional governors want resources redirected to domestic priorities, and nationalist factions want escalation, regardless of cost. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a military operation that has cost far more in blood and treasure than anyone in the Kremlin anticipated. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. That vulnerability doesn't make Putin less dangerous. It makes him more unpredictable. And that unpredictability is precisely what has Washington so concerned tonight. The White House's statement, now distributed to allied capitals worldwide, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russian strategic coercion to succeed. Senior officials said plainly that Putin's repositioning was inconsistent with stated commitments to de-escalation. That is diplomatic language for "we see what you're doing and we will not tolerate it." You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. The Pentagon simultaneously announced enhanced readiness measures for U.S. forces in Europe, though officials declined to specify which assets were being repositioned. NATO Secretary General released a coordinated statement expressing grave concern and reaffirming the alliance's commitment to collective defense, and multiple European capitals issued their own statements echoing Washington's assessment. This wasn't isolated concern, this was coordinated response. This was the alliance speaking with one voice. Meanwhile, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a defiant, measured speech tonight. He said, "We will not be intimidated by threats, whether they come wrapped in nuclear ambiguity or strategic repositioning." He said, "Every meter of Ukrainian soil will be defended and every aggression will be answered." And he said, "Tonight we demonstrated that Ukraine fights not just for survival, but for victory." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky's address was translated into 12 languages and broadcast across European networks within an hour of delivery. The message was clear: Ukraine remains in this fight, and it remains capable of striking back. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the strategic repositioning, Belarusian forces also conducted unusual exercises near the Polish border. Russian naval assets increased patrol activity in the Baltic Sea. Cyber operations increased significantly, targeting Ukrainian government infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. It means coordination. It means planning. It means intent. And intent is what intelligence analysts are now scrambling to understand. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing a major winter offensive designed to break Ukrainian lines before spring. Another is that Putin is attempting to create negotiating leverage by demonstrating escalation capacity. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to establish new territorial realities before any potential diplomatic window opens in 2026. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't wait for Allied consensus. They didn't wait for the threat to fully materialize. They struck first, and in doing so, they disrupted whatever timeline the Kremlin had constructed. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see whether pressure will fracture the Western coalition. Zelensky wants to show that Ukraine remains a capable, independent actor. Washington wants to prevent escalation spiral while maintaining deterrence, and European capitals want to prevent the conflict from expanding beyond Ukraine's borders. Each of these actors is operating with different constraints, different incentives, and different risk tolerances. And tonight, those calculations collided in ways that could define the next phase of this conflict. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian response to Ukraine's strikes. They say initial indications suggest significant disruption to Russian logistics networks. They say command and control communications in occupied territories have degraded measurably. And they say Putin's decision to reposition strategic assets is likely part of a broader coercion strategy intended to create negotiating leverage before 2026. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, swift, devastating, and precisely targeted, sent a message to Moscow that provocation will be met with capability. And it sent a message to Washington that Ukraine remains a partner worth supporting. That message matters enormously as political debates continue in Western capitals about the future of this conflict. As the days go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this week's repositioning. But what we do know is that Washington's response was timely. It reinforced alliance cohesion at a critical moment. It signaled American commitment despite domestic political uncertainty, and it provided diplomatic cover for Ukraine's military response. What happens next will depend on what the Kremlin does in the next 72 to 96 hours. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as a successful deterrence operation. If they escalate further, Washington and Kyiv have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are watching. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet, and when Putin is quiet, it means he is thinking, it means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he has learned many times but seems to forget, that Ukraine will not be intimidated, that Western resolve, while imperfect, remains substantive, and that the 2026 Doomsday Plan, whatever it truly contained, has already been complicated beyond recovery. This story is far from over. The coming weeks will reveal whether tonight's events represent a turning point or merely another chapter in a long and bloody conflict. But tonight, one thing is clear. Zelensky's final option was not a bluff. Washington's code red was not theater. And Putin's calculations have been disrupted in ways that may take months to fully understand. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.